I remember the smell first, not the blood that came later, but the grease. Machine grease mixed with something organic, something that had been cooking too long in the recyc units beneath sub-level 47. It's a smell that never leaves you once it's in your nostrils, in your sinuses, in that soft, wet place behind your eyes where memories are supposed to stay clean. The administratum complex on Vorsheim never smelled like anything else, not in the 312 days I worked there, not in the days after, when I was still technically employed but no longer, strictly speaking, among the living in any way that mattered to the quotas. My name was Hieronymus Valdrecht, Junior Archivist 3rd Class, subsection Mortuary Records, and I died at my desk on a Secundus morning while filing Form 774E cessation, which documented the death of one Mikhail Strand, Junior Archivist 3rd Class, subsection Mortuary Records. The irony would have amused me if I'd been capable of amusement by then. I wasn't. The capacity for humor had leaked out somewhere between the first cerebral hemorrhage and the moment my replacement sat down in my chair still warm from my body, and began processing my own death certificate without so much as checking if the previous occupant had been removed. They hadn't removed me because I hadn't fallen. That was the key detail. The small administrative oversight that transformed death from a categorical end into a bureaucratic ambiguity. I'd simply stopped. My heart seized mid-beat, my lungs froze mid-breath. But my spine remained rigid. My hands stayed positioned over the data slate. My eyes, still open, still wet, still technically functional for another 6 minutes, stayed focused on the flickering green text of Form 774E. To the overseer's cursory glance through the observation port, I was simply another drone in mid-documentation, unremarkable in my stillness, because stillness was the default state of our existence. The replacement arrived 14 minutes after my cessation. I know because the chronometer embedded in my desk, standard issue, crude mechanism, prone to drift, read 7:47 when my heart stopped and 8:1 when Servach Plantine escorted the new archivist to workstation 47B. My workstation, my desk, my chair, my corpse. The new archivist was a thin man, younger than I had been, with the pallor of someone who'd spent mandatory penance time in the lower chemical vats. His name was something forgettable. I never learned it. He never introduced himself to the dead man he was sitting beside. What I remember most vividly, more vividly than the sensation of my own death, which was surprisingly mundane, a soft grey absence rather than any dramatic collapse, was the sound of the chair scraping. Metal on stone, that particular shriek of unoiled joints that every archivist in sub-level 47 knew intimately. The new man pulled my chair 3 inches to the left to make room for his data slate, and in doing so, his elbow brushed against my arm. My dead arm. He paused. I felt it somehow, that pause. Felt the hesitation transmit through dead nerves that shouldn't have transmitted anything. But he didn't look. That was the thing. He didn't turn his head. He simply adjusted his position and began his work, and I understood in that moment, to the extent that the dead can understand anything, that he knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew. Workstation 47B had killed Mikhail Strand, had killed Seviana Ortis before him, had killed Prentice Loeb before her. A cursed desk, people whispered during the 7-minute prayer breaks, haunted, poisoned, bad air from the recyc units, tainted machine spirits in the data cogitators, psychic resonance from processing too many death records. Pick your superstition. The truth was more mundane and therefore more horrifying. The desk simply killed people, and the administratum simply replaced them, and the work simply continued. The grease smell intensified as the day progressed. Or perhaps my olfactory nerves were dying slower than the rest of me. clinging to their function with the stubborn persistence that had characterized my entire career. I could smell the new archivist's sweat, sour, tinged with the chemical residue from the vats, and beneath it, the older smell of my own body beginning its betrayal. Not rot, not yet. Just the first whisper of cellular breakdown, the microscopic surrender of tissues that had been holding formation for 43 years. The work continued. The new archivist processed forms with mechanical efficiency. Form 774E cessation for Valdrecht, Hieronymus, that was me, seeing my own name rendered in official script, my vitae reduced to identification codes and termination timestamps. Form 558K, replacement authorization. Form 112A, asset redistribution, cataloging my few possessions, 1 regulation data slate, 1 set of ceramic prayer beads, 1 faded pict capture of my mother, deceased. Form 993C, medical disposal requisition, noting that the body of Valdrecht Hieronymus would be collected by mortuary services during the second shift changeover and processed according to standard protocols. Except mortuary services never came. I waited insofar as the dead can wait. My consciousness or whatever fragment remained suspended in that terrible space between cessation and dissolution. The second shift arrived. The new archivist departed. A woman took his place, older, harder-faced, with augmetic fingers that clicked against the data slate keys with metronomic precision. She sat even closer to me than the first replacement had, her thigh pressed against mine, warmth bleeding through fabric into dead flesh. She didn't look at me either. By the third day I began to understand the topology of my situation. I was dead but not departed, present but not acknowledged, processed but not removed. I had become a ghost rendered in bureaucratic terminology, existing in the margins of filed forms and logged terminations, but somehow failing to manifest in the physical protocols that should have conveyed my corpse to the rendering vats. The administratum had killed me, documented my killing, assigned my replacement, redistributed my assets and logged my disposal, but the actual disposal, the crude physical act of removing my body from workstation 47B, had fallen through some gap in the procedural sequence. And so I remained, sitting upright in my chair, hands still positioned over the data slate, eyes still open and now definitely no longer wet, staring at forms that continued to flicker past in endless green procession. The new archivists worked around me, literally around me. When they needed more desk space, they shifted their data slates to avoid my frozen hands. When they stretched, they angled their arms to avoid brushing against my face. One particularly efficient worker, a young woman with the cropped hair of a penitent, developed the habit of hanging her prayer beads from my left index finger, which remained conveniently extended at a 90-degree angle. The smell evolved. By the 5th day, there was no hiding it. The grease and organic stench had become a grease and putrefaction stench, thick enough to taste, pervasive enough that even the broken air recyclers couldn't fully mask it. The archivists adapted. They wrapped scarves around their faces. They dabbed their nostrils with sacred oils. They burned incense sticks and propped them in the gaps of my data slate, transforming my workstation into a kind of improvised shrine. The smoke helped somewhat. It gave the smell a different character, converting decay into something almost ceremonial. Management noticed, of course. Servarch Plentine conducted his weekly inspection and stood for a full minute before workstation 47B, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on my gray-skinned face, my sunken eyes, my hands beginning to curl as tendons dried and contracted. I watched him watch me, and I understood that he understood perfectly well what he was seeing. A dead archivist, unremoved, unprocessed, an administrative discrepancy. He logged it. I know he logged it because the archivist working beside me, a nervous man named something with too many consonants, processed the form herself during the afternoon shift. Incident Report 47B947, anomalous object present at workstation. Object, not corpse, not body, not deceased personnel. Object. The language transformed me from human remains into a category of bureaucratic debris, something to be addressed through proper channels, via proper protocols, once proper authorization had been properly secured. 3 weeks later, the authorization still hadn't arrived. I had become part of the furniture, literally. My body had stiffened into permanent rigor, cementing my position at the desk. My skin had taken on the grey-green pallor of old parchment. My eyes had collapsed inward, leaving dark hollows that nonetheless still seemed to track movement, an optical illusion created by the angle of my skull and the flickering light from the data slates. The new archivists, I'd lost count of how many had cycled through by then, had begun decorating me. Prayer scrolls tucked into my collar, purity seals affixed to my sleeves. Someone had balanced a small icon of the Emperor on my head, and it had stayed there, held in place by the dried remnants of my hair. I had become a shrine to bureaucratic inertia, a monument to the gap between documentation and action, and the work continued. Always the work continued. Forms processed, deaths logged, replacements assigned, assets redistributed, disposal requisitions filed and ignored and filed again. The administratum ground forward with the inexorable momentum of a continental plate, crushing everything beneath it into uniform layers of compressed procedure. The smell never stopped getting worse. By the second month, it had achieved a kind of physical presence, a thickness in the air that seemed to muffle sound and distort vision. The archivists worked through it. They had no choice. The quotas demanded completion. The forms required processing. Subsection mortuary records could not pause simply because one of its functionaries had failed to properly die, had died in body but not in bureaucratic fact, leaving behind a corpse that existed in legal superposition, simultaneously present and absent, terminated and ongoing. I think that was when I began to dream, or perhaps remember. The distinction had become unclear. Images flickered through what remained of my consciousness, my mother's face, younger than in the pic capture, smiling in a way I'd forgotten, the proving grounds where I'd received my assignment, vast and echoing, a woman I'd loved or thought I'd loved, her name gone but her laugh somehow preserved, bright and incongruous, the first day at workstation 47B, the chair scraping, the smell of grease, the green flicker of forms demanding completion. Had Mikhail Strand experienced this? The man whose death I'd been processing when I died? Had he sat here, locked in his own corpse, watching his replacement work? Had Seviana Ortus? Had Prentice Loeb? How far back did this go? How many dead archivists had occupied workstation 47B, each one processed and logged and forgotten while their bodies remained, preserved by administrative oversight into permanent witness to their own obsolescence? The data slates held records going back centuries. I couldn't access them anymore. My fingers had become brittle black things, mummified by the dry air and chemical residue that filled sub-level 47. But I could see them, flickering past in endless procession as the living archivists worked. Form 774E cessation, thousands of them, tens of thousands, an unbroken chain of deaths logged and replacements assigned. How many had been properly removed? How many had fallen through the gap, trapped in the space between termination and disposal? The thought should have driven me mad. Perhaps it did. Perhaps madness was simply another thing that failed to properly manifest when filtered through administratum protocols. Insanity Report Form 6666M, filed but not processed, logged but not acted upon. I had become a theorem in bureaucratic mathematics, a proof that systems could continue to function even after they had fundamentally broken down, that procedure could outlive purpose, that documentation could substitute for reality indefinitely. The third month brought inspectors, not Servach Plentine with his cursory glances and incident reports, but actual inspectors from upper administrative, identifiable by their crimson seals and their augmetic vocal processors that rendered their voices into emotionless monotones. They examined Workstation 47B with great thoroughness, scanning, measuring, sampling the air quality and radiation levels and psychic resonance. They examined me as well, or rather, they examined the object that had been Hieronymus Valdrecht. They took samples, flakes of skin, fragments of hair, scrapings from beneath my blackened fingernails. They logged everything in data slates more sophisticated than any we used in subsection mortuary records. Then they left. The archivists returned to work. Nothing changed. I understood then, with the clarity that comes from absolute helplessness, that I would never be removed. Removal required action, and action required authorization, and authorization required acknowledgement that an error had occurred, and acknowledgement of error would require forms that documented the failure of previous forms, an infinite regression of paperwork that could never be completed, because each form demanding the completion of the previous form would itself require a subsequent form to verify its completion. The administratum was perfect, the administratum was eternal, the administratum could not err. Therefore, my presence at Workstation 47B, still seated, still positioned over the data slate, still decorated with prayer scrolls and purity seals, and that small icon of the Emperor balanced atop my skull, could not be an error. It must be intentional. It must serve some function, perhaps as a reminder of mortality to the living archivists, perhaps as a form of decoration, like the Gothic arches and the skull motifs that adorned every surface of the complex, perhaps as a test to see who would break first, the dead man or the system. The system would not break. I understood that now. The system was anti-fragile, growing stronger through its dysfunctions, converting errors into features, transforming bugs into protocols. My corpse had become a load-bearing element of subsection mortuary records. Remove me, and something essential might collapse. Better to leave me in place, to work around me, to transform me through sheer persistent ignorance into something that had always been there, a fixture as permanent as the walls and the smell of grease. Time lost meaning. The archivists cycled past, shift after shift, face after face, all of them eventually learning to navigate around the dead man at Workstation 47B, all of them processing their forms with the focused determination of those who understand that acknowledgement of the grotesque would be the first step toward madness. Better to pretend I was furniture. Better to hang their prayer beads from my fingers and balance their data slates against my arm, and continue the work, always the work, the endless forms demanding completion. I think it was the 7th month when I stopped being able to distinguish individual days. Or perhaps it was the 7th year. The chronometer had stopped working, or I had stopped being able to read it, or time itself had folded in on itself the way my body had folded, collapsing inward while maintaining external shape. The archivists looked younger now, or perhaps I had simply forgotten what youth looked like. They moved with the same exhausted efficiency they'd always moved with, processing the same forms I'd processed, logging the same deaths I'd logged, including mine, over and over. Form 774E cessation for Valdrecht, Hieronymus, a document that circulated through the system in perpetuity because it had been filed but not executed, logged but not resolved. The new archivist sometimes spoke to me, not to me precisely, but in my direction, murmuring prayers or complaints, or simply talking to themselves in the way that isolated people do. I listened. I had nothing else to do. Their words painted pictures of a world beyond sub-level 47, war in the eastern sectors, new tithes demanded, food quotas reduced, prayer shifts extended. The Imperium ground on, as indifferent to their suffering as the administratum was to mine. We were all being processed, all being documented, all being logged into systems that would continue long after we had been reduced to forms and statistics and archived memories. One archivist, a woman with burn scars covering half her face, began leaving offerings. Small things, a piece of fruit, carefully preserved in wax, a prayer card, a tiny mechanical bird that chirped when wounded. She placed them on the desk before me, arranging them with the care of someone tending a shrine. She never spoke, never explained, but I understood. She was praying to me, or through me, transforming my death in limbo into something sacred, something that might intercede with powers that cared about individual suffering. I wished I could tell her the truth. There were no such powers. There was only the administratum, and the administratum cared about nothing but its own perpetuation. We were all fuel for its continuation, our lives and deaths merely data points to be processed, our suffering merely friction to be minimized through proper procedure. The emperor might watch from his golden throne, but his gaze did not penetrate to sub-level 47, did not illuminate the forgotten corners where dead archivists sat unremoved, and living archivists slowly died of the same neglect that had killed their predecessors. The smell had achieved equilibrium, a steady state putrefaction that never worsened because there was nothing left to worsen, all volatile compounds having long since evaporated, leaving behind only the essential odor of death, stable and permanent. The incense helped less now. The archivists had adapted, their olfactory nerves deadened through constant exposure. They no longer flinched when sitting beside me. They no longer hesitated when their hands brushed against mine. I had become normalized, integrated, accepted. Sometimes I imagined the complex from above, a vast Gothic structure sprawling across kilometers of Vorsheim's surface, its spires reaching toward the grey sky, its foundations extending down through hundreds of levels. Somewhere in the highest spires, administrators made decisions that rippled down through the bureaucracy, creating forms and protocols and quotas. Somewhere in the middle levels, enforcers ensured compliance, punishing deviation, maintaining order. And here, in the lowest levels, we archived death, processing the endless stream of terminations that fed the Imperium's hunger for documentation. And at workstation 47B, I sat, neither living nor properly dead, trapped in the gap between procedure and execution, a monument to the eternal truth that systems care nothing for the individuals they process. The administratum had killed me and forgotten to dispose of the body, and this oversight had transformed me into something permanent, something that would outlast any individual functionary, any particular administrator, perhaps even the complex itself. I think the worst part was not the death. Death had been easy, a soft surrender, a cessation of struggle. The worst part was the continuation, the grinding eternity of watching the work continue without me, of understanding that I had been replaced before I'd finished dying, that my replacement had been replaced, that replacements had been replaced by replacements in an unbroken chain, and that none of it mattered, none of it changed anything. The forms still demanded completion, and the quotas still demanded fulfillment, and the administratum still ground forward, converting life into documentation, death into statistics, suffering into archived records. The woman with the burn scars stopped coming. In her place came a man with trembling hands, probably a stim addict, processing forms with frantic speed. Then a younger woman, then an older man, then people whose faces I could no longer distinguish, all of them sitting at workstation 47B, all of them working around the corpse that would not be removed, all of them slowly dying of the same exhaustion and neglect and poisoned air that had killed me. Sometimes I wondered if they would join me. If one day the man with trembling hands would simply stop mid-keystroke, his heart seizing as mine had, his body freezing in place, and whether he too would remain unremoved, another object to work around, another fixture of workstation 47B. Perhaps that was the true purpose of this place, not to archive death but to demonstrate it, to create a living museum of bureaucratic failure where the dead slowly accumulated, layer upon layer, until the entire subsection became a catacomb of archived functionaries, all of them still seated at their desks, still positioned over their data slates, still waiting for disposal requisitions that would never be properly executed. The icon of the Emperor fell from my skull. I couldn't see it fall, my eyes had long since collapsed completely, but I heard it, a small metallic clink as it struck the stone floor. No one picked it up. It remained there, somewhere beneath the desk, forgotten like everything else in this place. The Emperor protects, the saying went, but the Emperor's protection did not extend to sub-level 47. Here, there was only the Administratum, and the Administratum protected nothing except its own procedures. I tried to remember why I had wanted this position. There must have been a reason. Everyone who worked for the Administratum had made choices, had signed contracts, had sworn oaths. I must have believed in something once: purpose, duty, service to the Imperium, the nobility of documentation, the importance of proper records. All of it seemed impossibly distant now, as remote and incomprehensible as the stars beyond Vorsheim's polluted sky. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. I had wanted to survive. The Administratum offered employment, rations, shelter, a place in the vast machinery of imperial governance. It asked only for life and soul in exchange, and I had given both willingly, believing that service would be rewarded, that diligence would be recognized, that loyalty would mean something. But the Administratum did not reward or recognize or care. It simply consumed, processing workers as efficiently as it processed forms, converting them into archive data and moving on. And when the workers died, when they ceased to be useful, the Administratum logged their termination and assigned replacements and continued forward. And if some small administrative error resulted in bodies being left unremoved, in corpses being converted into furniture, in the dead being forced to witness the endless perpetuation of their own obsolescence, well, that was simply the cost of maintaining the system. Acceptable losses, documented but not corrected, logged but not resolved. The chronometer must have started working again because I became aware of time passing in discrete units. Hours, days, weeks, or perhaps I had simply learned to measure time by the rhythm of shift changes, the cyclic arrival and departure of archivists, the predictable patterns of work and rest that structured existence in sub-level 47. The pattern never varied. Morning prayers, 15 minutes. Work period, 4 hours. Brief nutritional break, 10 minutes. Work period, 4 hours. Evening prayers, 15 minutes. Sleep shift, 8 hours. Repeat, repeat, repeat until death, and then continue repeating around the corpse. I had become the hub around which the pattern turned, the fixed point that gave meaning to the cycle. The archivists oriented themselves relative to my position, left of the dead man, behind the corpse, facing the skull. I was their compass, their landmark, their memento mori rendered in desiccated flesh, and I watched them, even without eyes I watched them, memorizing their faces and their names and their small acts of humanity, a shared smile, a whispered complaint, a hand briefly touching another hand in momentary connection before returning to the data slate. They were dying too, all of them, just more slowly than I had. The recycled air poisoned them incrementally, the bad light destroyed their vision, the repetitive motion crippled their hands, the stress eroded their minds. Every archivist who sat at workstation 47B was being killed by it, just as I had been killed, just as Mikael Strand and Seviana Ortus and Prentice Loeb had been killed. The desk was a mouth, slowly chewing, and the Administratum kept feeding out workers, kept replacing the dead with the living, kept the work flowing because the work was all that mattered. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to scream, to grab their shoulders, to shake them into awareness, flee, escape, abandon your post, accept punishment, accept death, accept anything but this slow conversion into archived statistics. But I had no voice, no hands, no capacity for action. I was object, not subject, furniture, not person. A cautionary tale that no one would read, because cautionary tales required acknowledgement of danger, and acknowledging danger would require acknowledging error, and acknowledging error would require forms that could never be completed. The man with trembling hands did eventually die. Not at the desk. He made it 2 steps away before collapsing, his heart finally succumbing to whatever stim cocktail had been keeping it beating. They removed him within an hour, efficiently, 2 servitors hauling the body away, while a third cleaned the floor where he'd fallen. Procedure worked when the death was clear, unambiguous, properly manifested. It was only deaths like mine, deaths that occurred without falling, without visible drama, without clear transition from living worker to dead object, that fell through the gap. His replacement was a girl, young enough that she shouldn't have been assigned to subsection mortuary records. 14 at most, with the wide eyes of someone who still believed the administrator might care about her youth, her fear, her humanity. She sat at workstation 47B and cried silently while processing forms, tears falling onto the data slate, and no one said anything because there was nothing to say. We all cried eventually, those of us assigned to the mortuary subsections. We cried until we ran out of tears, and then we continued working, and then we died, and the administratum logged our deaths and assigned our replacements, and the work continued. I think I loved her, that crying girl, the way the dead love the living, desperately, uselessly, with the knowledge that love changes nothing and means nothing but persists anyway because it is all that remains. She decorated my corpse with fresh flowers, real flowers somehow acquired through barter or theft, and their smell briefly overpowered the smell of decay, transforming workstation 47B into something almost beautiful. The flowers died quickly in the chemical air, wilting and browning, but she replaced them, kept replacing them, a small act of defiance against the ugliness that surrounded us. She lasted 3 months, not death but reassignment, a minor mercy granted by some administrator who'd noticed her age and felt a flicker of something resembling conscience. They sent her to a higher level, a better assignment, a place where perhaps she might survive long enough to forget the time she'd spent working beside a corpse. I hoped so. I hoped she would forget, would adapt, would become the kind of hardened functionary who could process death without feeling, who could sit beside the dead without crying. But I also hoped she wouldn't forget, that she would carry some fragment of this horror with her, would remember the dead man at workstation 47B and the flowers she'd brought him, and that this memory would serve as inoculation against complete surrender to the system. A small rebellion, preserved in memory, meaningless but precious precisely because it was meaningless, because it served no function, because it was purely human in a place designed to process humanity out of humans. Her replacement was older, harder, exactly the kind of person who belonged in subsection mortuary records. He sat down without hesitation, removed the dead flowers from my corpse without ceremony, and began processing forms with mechanical efficiency. The work continued. It always continued. That was the only certainty in sub-level 47. Whatever else happened, however many archivists died or were reassigned or went mad, the work would continue, the forms would be processed, the deaths would be logged. I began to fragment. Not physically, my body had achieved a kind of eternal stasis, mummified by the dry chemical air, preserved indefinitely, but mentally, psychologically, whatever ghost of consciousness remained trapped in desiccated neurons. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Sometimes a shift would feel like years, each second extending into a subjective eternity. Sometimes months would pass in what felt like moments, faces blurring together, forms flickering past too fast to distinguish. I lost track of myself. Who had Hieronymus Valdrek been? What had he wanted? What had he believed? The memories dissolved like the flowers the crying girl had brought, wilting and browning and crumbling into dust. All that remained was the essential fact of my situation. I was dead but not removed, present but not acknowledged, trapped in the gap between documentation and reality, converted into a permanent witness to my own obsolescence. More inspectors came, different ones this time, wearing the insignia of the Administratum's Quality Assurance Division, carrying scanners that hummed and clicked as they examined Workstation 47B. They seemed excited, in the muted way that bureaucrats get excited, filing reports with unusual speed, voxing updates to superiors. Something about my situation interested them. Perhaps I had become a test case, a subject of study, an example to be analyzed and documented and incorporated into new procedures. The thought should have angered me. Instead, I felt something like hope. If they were studying me, perhaps they would eventually resolve my ambiguous status. Perhaps a form would be filed that would require my removal. Perhaps after however many months or years I'd been sitting here, someone would finally sign the authorization that would free me from this chair, this desk, this eternal grinding witness to bureaucratic perpetuation. But nothing changed. The inspectors left. The work continued. I remained. I think it was the following year, or perhaps the year after that, or perhaps only a month later, time had become meaningless, when I finally understood my true function. I was not a mistake. I was not an oversight. I was not an error waiting to be corrected. I was a feature. The Administratum had not failed to remove me, it had chosen to preserve me, had integrated my corpse into the procedural architecture of subsection mortuary records, had transformed my death into a permanent memorial to the truth that death changes nothing, that workers are replaceable, that the system continues regardless of individual suffering. I was a lesson taught in silence, absorbed through proximity. This is your fate, this is what awaits you. This is the only immortality the Administratum offers, not remembrance, not honor, not even proper disposal, but this, eternal presence, eternal witness, eternal service even in death. The archivists who worked beside me learned this lesson without conscious awareness, absorbed it through their pores, carried it with them when they were reassigned or when they died, and it shaped them, made them harder, made them more efficient, made them better servants of the system that would eventually consume them just as it had consumed me, and I understood, with the awful clarity that comes too late to matter, that this was intentional. Some administrator, centuries ago perhaps, had recognized the pedagogical value of unremoved corpses, had deliberately introduced gaps into disposal procedures, had created workstations like 47B that killed their occupants and preserved the bodies, not through error but through design. The Administratum's cruelty was not incidental, it was structural, purposeful, optimized over millennia to extract maximum utility from its workers both in life and death. The Emperor protects, the saying went, but the Emperor protected the Imperium, not the individuals within it, and the Imperium was the Administratum, and the Administratum was forms and procedures and protocols that reduced human beings to data points, to statistics, to objects to be processed and logged and archived. We were all being slowly converted into documentation, our lives translated into files, our deaths into forms, our suffering into archived records that would outlast our bodies and our memories, and any evidence that we had ever been more than numbers in someone's ledger. I wanted to weep, I wanted to rage, I wanted to curse the Emperor and the Imperium and the vast uncaring machinery that had ground me into this state, but I had no tears, no voice, no capacity for emotion that wasn't immediately sublimated into the eternal gray sameness of my existence. I was beyond anger, beyond grief, beyond everything except awareness, awareness of the work continuing, of the forms being processed, of the archivists dying and being replaced, of the eternal cycle grinding forward with the slow inevitability of tectonic motion. The current archivist, I'd lost count of how many had cycled through, was a middle-aged woman with augmetic eyes that glowed faintly red in the dim light. She worked with the concentrated efficiency of someone who'd made peace with her situation, who'd accepted that this was her life and would be until it ended, and that her ending would be logged and processed and forgotten like all the others. She never decorated my corpse, never spoke in my direction, never acknowledged my presence, except to avoid bumping my rigid limbs as she worked. I appreciated that, somehow. Her complete lack of sentiment felt more honest than the prayers and offerings others had provided. She understood what I represented, not a person to be mourned, but a fact to be worked around, an obstacle in the procedural landscape, a permanent fixture of Workstation 47B that required neither reverence nor revulsion, only navigation. She would die here. I knew it with the certainty of long observation. She had the look of someone who'd reached her final assignment, who'd been shuffled down through progressively worse postings until landing in subsection mortuary records, the terminus of all bureaucratic careers. She would process forms until her body failed, and then either she would be removed, if her death was clean, unambiguous, properly manifested, or she would join me, another corpse preserved by administrative gap, another object to work around. I hoped, for her sake, that her death would be clean, that she would collapse obviously dramatically, in a way that demanded acknowledgement and response, that she would be spared this state of suspended obsolescence, this grey eternity of watching the work continue without her. But hope was just another thing the administratum had processed out of me, ground down into dust and archived in some forgotten file, where it could serve no function and inspire no change. The grease smell had achieved a kind of perfection, a steady-state odor that encompassed both the mechanical and the organic, the living and the dead, the functional and the failed. It was the smell of the administratum itself, I realized, the smell of systems that continue beyond their purpose, of procedures that outlive their usefulness, of vast machinery grinding forward, not because it achieves anything, but because stopping would require acknowledgement that starting had been a mistake. And the administratum could not err. It was perfect. It was eternal. It would continue processing forms long after Vorsheim's son had died, long after the last human had been archived and logged, long after the galaxy itself had grown cold and dark. Because the work demanded completion, and completion demanded forms, and forms demanded processing, and processing demanded archivists, dead or alive, seated at their workstations, hands positioned over their data slates, eyes, present or absent, functional or collapsed, staring at the green flicker of eternal documentation. I was Hieronymus Voldrecht, Junior Archivist, 3rd Class, Subsection Mortuary Records, and I had been dead for an eternity that might have been years or decades or merely months, and I would remain dead at Workstation 47B until the administratum itself ceased, which would be never, which meant I would remain here forever, a monument to the truth that service to the Imperium did not end with death, that duty was eternal, that the only escape from the system was to be fully consumed by it, processed and logged and archived until even the memory of having been human was ground down into data and filed away. The work continued. It always continued. And I watched, unable to look away, unable to die any more thoroughly than I already had, trapped in the gap between cessation and disposal, converted into a permanent witness to the only truth that mattered. The administratum was eternal, the work was endless, and we were all, living and dead, acknowledged and ignored, properly terminated and administratively ambiguous. We were all just fuel for its continuation, our suffering transformed into procedure, our deaths into documentation, our lives into archived records that no one would ever read, because reading them would require caring, and caring would require humanity, and humanity was the first thing the administratum processed out of its workers. They replaced me without checking if I was dead. That was the essential fact, the foundational truth, the core reality around which everything else orbited. They replaced me, and the work continued, and I remained, and nothing changed, and nothing would ever change. World without end, forever and ever, in service to the Emperor and the Imperium, and the vast grinding machinery that valued documentation over life, procedure over mercy, system over soul. The forms flickered past, green text on black screens, an endless procession of deaths logged and lives archived and workers terminated and replacements assigned. Form 774E cessation, thousands upon thousands, each one representing a life reduced to data, a person converted into file, a human being processed into statistics. And somewhere in that endless stream was my form, filed but not executed, logged but not resolved, circulating through the system in perpetual limbo, just like the corpse that had generated it. I was documentation now. That was my immortality. Not my body slowly mummifying at workstation 47B, but the form that described my termination, the file that logged my cessation, the record that archived my obsolescence. I existed as text, as data, as a series of characters in some vast database, and I would exist that way forever, or at least until the administratum's storage systems finally failed, which would be never, which meant forever. The woman with augmetic eyes paused in her work. Her hands, which had been moving with metronomic consistency, stopped. She turned her head, slowly, deliberately, and looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. Our eyes met, her glowing red augmetics focusing on my collapsed sockets, and I saw recognition in her gaze. She understood, she knew, she had always known. She opened her mouth, and I thought she might speak, might acknowledge, might break the silence that had surrounded my death for however long I'd been sitting here. But no sound emerged. Instead, she simply turned back to her data slate and resumed work, her hands finding their rhythm again, the moment of recognition passing as quickly as it had come. And I understood that this too was part of the system, part of the procedure, part of the vast architecture of cruelty that the administratum had perfected over millennia. She knew I was here. They all knew. Every archivist who'd sat at workstation 47B had known, had understood, had made the choice to continue working beside the dead because acknowledging me would require acknowledging the horror, and acknowledging the horror would require action, and action would require forms, and forms would require authorization, and authorization would require admitting error, and admitting error would break the perfect circle of procedure that kept the system running. So she worked, and I watched, and the forms flickered past, and the smell of grease and decay and incense filled the air, and time dilated and compressed, and lost all meaning, and somewhere in the complex above US administrators made decisions and enforcers maintained order, and the vast machinery of the Imperium ground forward, processing humanity into statistics, life into data, suffering into archived records. They replaced me without checking if I was dead, and in doing so, they had trapped me in a state worse than death, eternal witness to my own obsolescence, permanent monument to the truth that individuals meant nothing, that workers were replaceable, that the only immortality the administratum offered was the immortality of documentation, of being reduced to forms and files and archive data that would outlast memory and meaning, and any evidence that we had ever been human. The Emperor protects, but the Emperor's protection did not extend here, to Sublevel 47, to Workstation 47B, to the forgotten corners where dead archivists sat unremoved, and living archivists slowly died of the same neglect. Here, there was only the administratum, eternal and perfect and utterly indifferent, grinding forward with the inexorable momentum of a machine that had forgotten its purpose but could not stop, because stopping would require acknowledging that starting had been a mistake. And the work continued, always the work continued, world without end, forever and ever, in service to systems that valued nothing but their own perpetuation. Amen.